The defender grips the cold stone of the Paris wall until his knuckles turn white. His lungs burn from the thick, oily smoke rising off the Seine River. Just as his fingers begin to slip, a flaming projectile launched by the Viking fleet slams into the wooden barricade only inches from his face. The heat singes his hair, and the roar of the river below is drowned out by the shouts of invaders hungry for the city's heart. To the men on those walls, this was a battle for survival. But they were wrong. This was not a mindless tribal assault, nor was it a random act of chaos. It was the violent, high-stakes final audit of an empire that had relied on protection fees for too long. The Vikings were not merely warriors, they were a massive, ruthless enterprise operating with cold efficiency. This siege functioned as a precision delivery system for capital. The Viking enterprise weaponized the city's strategic dependence on the river to trap its economy.
Scouts warn of a garrison at the bend. We have surprise. We can take them. Then it is settled. Ready the men.
They didn't just want to pillage and leave, they were executing a hostile corporate takeover. By squeezing Paris, they intended to turn their long-running protection racket into a permanent, ironclad grip on the kingdom's wealth. What the defenders saw as a fight for their lives was actually a calculated move in a much larger business deal, one where human life was just a line item to be liquidated for profit.
It's all there. See that it is. Protection is assured?
To carry out this massive takeover, the Viking enterprise used technology that turned the Seine River into a mechanical death trap. They arrived with a terrifying fleet of 700 ships, filling the river so tightly that the water seemed to vanish beneath a sea of wood and iron. This was not just a collection of boats, it was an engineering marvel designed to isolate Paris completely. By anchoring their fleet across the river and surrounding the island city, they formed a solid wall that cut off all food, supplies, and messengers. The Seine, which was once the city's lifeblood, became a prison gate that the Vikings locked from the outside. This disaster happened because of how Paris was designed. The city sat on an island in the middle of the river, acting as a natural bottleneck for trade. Every merchant ship carrying goods through the heart of the kingdom had to pass directly under the gaze of the city's bridges. While this location made Paris wealthy and powerful, it also made it the perfect target for a hostile takeover. The Vikings understood this geography better than anyone else. They knew that if they grabbed this one bottleneck, they would have a hand on the throat of the entire region. They did not just want to destroy the city, they wanted to squeeze it. By occupying this strategic spot, they created an engineered dependency. The city was physically built to rely on the flow of the river, and the Vikings used that reliance against it. Every day that the siege lasted, the people inside the walls felt their options shrinking. The Vikings were not fighting a war in the traditional sense, they were performing a calculated economic strike. They had identified the exact point where the kingdom's economy was most vulnerable and clamped down, waiting for the city to pay whatever price was demanded just to breathe again. To understand why the Vikings were so desperate to lock down Paris, you have to look at what was happening in their own camps back north. For years, they had made their wealth by raiding smaller villages and coastal towns, but those markets were drying up. After so many attacks, there was simply nothing left to steal. They were facing what we would call diminishing returns, they were spending more effort and resources on raids that brought in less and less reward. Their own supply chains back in Scandinavia were starting to buckle, and they needed a massive, game-changing payday to stabilize their operations. This is where the Danegeld comes in. The Vikings didn't just want gold for the sake of it, they needed a steady flow of liquid silver to pay their soldiers, buy new ships, and keep their influence alive. Paris was the target that could solve all their problems at once. By trapping the city, the Vikings were essentially triggering a forced liquidation of the Carolingian dynasty's wealth. They knew that the French leaders had silver hidden away in church vaults, royal treasuries, and private collections. By holding the city hostage, the Vikings were forcing the king to open every vault and empty every chest to pay them off. This was not a war of conquest in the traditional sense, it was a hostile buyout of the kingdom's remaining capital. Every day the siege went on, the price of peace went up. The Vikings were effectively liquidating the dynasty's assets to fuel their own recovery. They had identified the one place in the region that still held enough concentrated wealth to reset their economy. They didn't care about the long-term health of the French land or its people, they only cared about extracting the largest possible sum of silver in the shortest amount of time. They were moving from small-scale theft to a massive, kingdom-sized extraction, treating the entire Carolingian treasure like a bankrupt business that was finally ready to be sold off for parts. The real poison in this situation was the Danegeld. While it was presented as a payment for peace, it was actually a deadly economic trap that drained the kingdom of its liquid silver. Silver was the lifeblood of the Frankish economy, used for everything from daily market trades to long-distance commerce. When the king poured this wealth into the hands of the Viking invaders, he was not just giving away treasure, he was stalling the entire growth of the kingdom. With the silver gone, there was no money left to repair roads, maintain bridges, or build up the city's defenses. The king was forced to prioritize these massive payments over the basic needs of his people, effectively sacrificing the future of the nation just to buy a few days of quiet. This weaponized trade crippled the local peasantry, who were the ones forced to pay the price. To gather the mountain of silver demanded by the Vikings, the elite increased taxes to a breaking point. Farmers, who were already struggling through bad harvests and war, found themselves taxed to death. They were expected to fund the protection that their leaders promised but failed to provide. The nobility were essentially selling the farmers' hard work to the very people who were burning their fields.
You let us starve!
It was a cycle of misery where the poorest citizens were squeezed dry to save the
You
richest.
let us starve!
The more the Vikings
We will
demanded,
not
the
leave.
more the king took from his people, leaving the countryside starving and angry. This wasn't just a loss of money, it was a total breakdown of the social contract. The people saw their leaders hand over their life savings to the invaders while their homes remained unprotected and their bellies remained empty. By turning the economy into a one-way pipeline for Viking profit, the leadership made sure that the common people paid the highest cost for the king's inability to defend the realm. The Danegeld acted as a slow-acting poison, weakening the roots of the kingdom until the entire structure began to wobble. The tragedy of this siege was never a secret to those who held the keys to the kingdom. The Frankish nobility and the high leaders of the church watched the Viking fleet arrive with perfect clarity. They saw the 700 ships fill the Seine and tracked every movement of the enemy. In fact, they recorded these details in their own chronicles, documenting the exact dates and the growing danger with cold precision. They knew exactly how the Viking enterprise functioned, yet they chose to hide the truth from the people who were actually suffering on the front lines. To keep the social order from shattering, the elite used a powerful form of deception. They told the frightened citizens and the starving farmers that the Vikings were not a business-minded enemy to be fought, but a divine punishment sent by God for the sins of the people. By framing the siege as an act of heaven, they protected their own position. If the violence was a spiritual test, then the people had to stay quiet, suffer in silence, and obey their masters. It was a brilliant way to stop the populace from questioning why the king could not defend his own capital. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the elite were playing a completely different game. They were not waiting for divine mercy, they were busy negotiating their own private exit strategies. While they preached about repentance to the masses,
The gold for the crossing, as agreed. And your silence, chieftain.
the nobility often made secret deals with the Viking leaders to buy safe passage for their own families and move their personal treasures to safety. They sacrificed the city's security to save their own skin, essentially trading the future of the kingdom for a chance to escape the destruction they helped create. They allowed the city to be bled dry as long as it kept their own assets protected. It was a masterclass in hypocrisy, proving that even while the walls were shaking, those in power were more interested in protecting their private interests than in leading the people who looked to them for help. Inside the walls of Paris, the reality was bleak. Citizens were trapped in a nightmare, facing starvation as their food supplies ran out and the structures of their city began to crumble under constant attack. While the people were pushed to the edge of death, the king remained outside the walls. He was not rushing to break the siege or engage the enemy in a final battle. Instead, he chose to wait, stalling his military forces in hopes of finding better leverage to secure his own position. For the king, the suffering of the Parisians was just a tactical detail, a bargaining chip he was willing to spend while he calculated the best moment to step in. This massive gap between the leadership and the people revealed a broken system. The government viewed the Frankish heartland as a disposable asset. They were willing to let the region fall into ruins and let the people suffer through total destruction, caring little for the long-term cost to the families who lived there. The system treated the survival of the nation as secondary to the political games of the ruling class. They only cared about the defense of the city once the potential loss of Paris threatened their own power and status. It was a cold, calculated delay that ignored the basic duty of a ruler to protect those he governed. By treating the city as a piece on a chessboard rather than a home for thousands of people, the leaders allowed the situation to spiral until the cost of losing it became too high for their own interests.
Run! The Vikings are coming!
They didn't act out of mercy or duty, but out of a desperate need to keep their grip on the throne. This failure of regulation, or rather, the total lack of care for the public, proved that the leaders were not really fighting for the people at all. They were waiting for the right moment to claim victory, even if it meant that half the city had to starve or burn to get them there. The system had effectively abandoned its people, leaving them to pay the price for a leadership that saw them as nothing more than fuel for a political fire. When the fighting finally stopped, the ruling class did not celebrate a glorious military triumph. In truth, they had not won a total victory at all. Instead, they executed a clever and cold-blooded market pivot.
Your word? Our axe stays sheathed for the silver. Then mark the boundary here. Agreed. We pivot to prosperity.
They looked at the Vikings, who had spent years burning their towns and draining their gold, and decided to offer them a new deal.
This charter grants your people the lands of the northern marches. In return, you will defend our borders. We accept. The lands are ours, and we will hold them.
Through the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, the leaders of the kingdom essentially hired the Vikings to protect the very lands they had spent so long destroying. It was the ultimate business move, taking a dangerous threat and turning it into a security team. This was not an act of peace born from kindness, it was a transition to a more stable way of doing business. By giving the raiders land and official titles, the Vikings transformed into the Normans, the new landlords of northern France.
Rise, warrior of the north. In the name of the king, I invest you with the title of lord of these lands. I accept this charge and swear my fealty.
For the Vikings, this was a brilliant trade. They no longer had to deal with the costs and risks of active war, such as lost ships, dead soldiers, or the unpredictable nature of raids. Now, they were guaranteed a steady, predictable stream of income from rent and local taxes. They had effectively rebranded themselves from outlaws to government officials, securing their wealth without having to fight for it every single day. This pivot solved the problem for the elite as well. By making the Vikings the new owners of the land, the king no longer had to worry about defending that territory from them. The former raiders were now responsible for stopping other Viking fleets from attacking, making them the first line of defense. The system had simply shifted the responsibility. The Vikings gained a permanent seat at the table of power, and the ruling class gained a protection force that didn't need to be paid in stolen silver anymore. The tragedy is that nothing was actually fixed. The people who lived on the land were still subject to the same predatory power, only now the names and the labels had changed. The exploitation didn't stop, it just became more organized, more sustainable, and much easier to manage. In the end, we have to face the truth: Paris did not truly defeat the Vikings. There was no grand victory that cleared the invaders from the land and restored freedom to the people. Instead, the system simply swallowed them up. By bringing the Viking leaders into the fold and giving them titles and land, the ruling class showed the world that exploitation is easily rebranded as governance. The raiders didn't stop being predators, they just stopped using swords and started using laws and property rights to achieve the exact same goal. They proved that if you want to control a population, you don't always need to burn their homes. Sometimes, it is much more effective to simply put your own name on the deed. We are taught to look at the history books and see this as a glorious moment for Paris, a time when the city stood strong against the storm. But we have to ask ourselves, was it really a victory, or was it just a management change in a corrupt system? The same people who were paying the Danegeld to stop the violence were the ones who ultimately paid the Vikings to stay. The common citizens who suffered through the starvation and the fear saw very little change in their own lives. They went from being victims of a protection racket.
Keep pace, subjects. The fields must be ready.
To being subjects of a new lord, all while the people at the top of the social ladder kept their status and their wealth perfectly safe. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. It leaves us with a difficult question: what other protectors in our history books were actually just the same system with a new label? We often celebrate the heroes of the past without questioning the structures they were protecting. By digging into these stories, we can start to see that many victories were really just shifts in power that kept the same cycle of extraction running for everyone else. If you found this look at the hidden side of history fascinating, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. That way, you will be the first to be notified the moment we upload our next amazing video, where we will continue to pull back the curtain on the stories that history books usually leave out.